The gates at the Harlan County Fairgrounds opened at 8 that morning, and by the time the first truck chained up, 4,300 people had come through them. Most had already made up their minds. It was the kind of September day Kentucky sometimes gives you as an apology for August. The humidity had let go overnight. The air had broken, and the sky sat at that particular shade of deep blue that only arrives after a long heat has finally passed. By 10 o'clock, the grandstands were full. People had driven in from Harlan and Cumberland, from Lynch and Evarts, and a handful had come from as far as Whitesburg and Middlesboro, because word had traveled the way it travels in that part of the country. Co-op bulletin boards, Sunday parking lots after church, that particular telephone chain that activates in a rural county when something worth watching is about to happen on a fairground infield. The pull was billed as a memorial. Ray Combs had passed the previous November, and the county had organized the event in his name. That was why his granddaughter Emma had driven down from Lexington that morning with a truck she hadn't touched in 4 years, parked on a borrowed trailer, hauled behind a pickup that was older than her youngest brother. 3 hours and 40 minutes on the road to get there. She'd back the truck off the trailer herself in the staging area, and while she worked the ramps and the chocks alone, 3 members of the Tri-State Diesel Motorsports team stood 20 feet away and watched her do it. The machine that had drawn the most attention that day was parked in the second staging lane. It belonged to a fabrication outfit out of Fort Collins called Meridian Performance, and it had been built over the course of 14 months at a cost that the team's sponsorship coordinator had not been shy about sharing with anyone who asked, which was $387,000 in components alone, before you counted labor and transport. The truck was a purpose-built competition rig on a late-model Kenworth platform, painted in the team's colors, which were a deep metallic blue and a particular shade of orange that the coordinator referred to as Colorado copper. The engine was a turbocharged and intercooled inline-6, making somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,400 horsepower on the dyno sheet the coordinator had laminated and posted on the side of the trailer. The crew numbered 6 people, all of them wearing matching shirts. The machine in the fourth staging lane was a 1975 Peterbilt 359 that had not been repainted since 1987, when someone had applied a coat of red oxide primer to the cab and then apparently decided that was sufficient. The hood had a crease in it that ran from the passenger side corner to a point about 8 inches left of center, the kind of crease that comes from a specific event on a specific day and stays there forever. The registration paperwork listed the owner as Darlene Pruitt of Coaldale, Colorado, which is a town of approximately 130 people, located 22 miles east of Salida on Highway 50, sitting at the bottom of a canyon where the Arkansas River comes down off the mountains and begins to flatten out toward Canyon City. The people standing nearest to the fourth staging lane had been watching Darlene since she'd pulled in at 7 that morning, and what they'd watched her do was open the hood, rest her forearms on the front of the engine, and look at it for approximately 4 minutes without touching anything. Then she'd close the hood, walk to the rear axle, and check the tire pressure on all 4 drives with a gauge she kept in her shirt pocket. Then she'd sat in the cab with the door open and drank coffee from a green thermos and watched the track crew finish dragging the pull lane into condition. One of the Meridian Performance crew members had walked over at around 9:30 to look at the Peterbilt, the way you might walk over to look at something in a museum that you couldn't quite identify. He'd stood at the front of the truck for a moment, looked at the crease in the hood, looked at the primer, looked at the hand-lettered number on the door, which was 44, applied in white paint with what appeared to be a 2-inch brush, and then walked back to his trailer without saying anything. 2 of his crewmates had been watching from the trailer steps, and when he got back to them, one of them said something and all 3 of them laughed. Darlene was watching from the cab. She did not react. She poured more coffee from the thermos and looked back at the track. Now, I need to stop here and explain something, because without this next part, what happens on that track in the afternoon is just a number on a score sheet, and it is not just a number. It is the end of a very long argument that Darlene Pruitt had been having with the physics of altitude since the winter of 2019. And to understand why she won that argument, you need to understand what altitude does to a diesel engine and what she did about it. Here's something worth knowing about where Darlene came from. Her father, Russell Pruitt, ran a fuel delivery business out of Coaldale for 31 years, which in that part of Colorado means you drive a tanker truck over mountain passes in conditions that would close a highway in most other states. Russell had 2 rules about mechanical work. The first was that you do not guess when you can measure. The second was that you do not buy what you can build. Darlene had grown up in the shop behind the house on County Road 6, and she had learned to read a micrometer before she learned to read a speedometer, because Russell believed the order mattered. She had rebuilt her first engine at 14, a 3208 Cat out of a retired delivery truck, and she had kept the service manual from that job in a plastic sleeve in the shop ever since. Not as a trophy, but as a reference, because she still thought it was the clearest explanation of fuel delivery timing she had ever read. She had bought the Peterbilt in the fall of 2018 from an estate sale in Poncha Springs, which is a town of about 800 people at the junction of highways 285 and 50, sitting at 7,460 feet. The truck had belonged to a man named Gerald Oates, who had run it as a log hauler for 22 years and had maintained it with the kind of religious consistency that log haulers develop, because the alternative is dying on a mountain road with a full load behind you. When Darlene opened the hood at the estate sale, the engine, a Cummins NT C400 Big Cam, was cleaner than most engines she had seen in working shops. She paid $14,200 for the truck, which was $800 more than Gerald's daughter had been asking, because Darlene felt the asking price was not respectful of what the truck was. She drove it home to Coaldale and put it in the shop and did not pull it back out for 3 months because she was measuring. She measured the bore on all 6 cylinders. She measured the injector timing. She measured the turbocharger shaft play and the compressor wheel clearance. She measured the fuel delivery rate at idle and at full throttle and at every increment between. She wrote all of it down in a spiral notebook, which she labeled with the truck's VIN and the date and her name, and she kept it on the shelf above the bench where she kept every other notebook she had kept since 1994. Here is the intellectual key to everything that happened on that track in August. I need you to stay with me for a few minutes, because this is the part that the Meridian Performance team, for all their laminated dyno sheets and matched shirts, had not fully reckoned with. At 5,840 feet above sea level, the air is approximately 18% less dense than it is at sea level. For a naturally aspirated engine, that means 18% less oxygen per intake stroke, which means 18% less fuel can be burned completely, which means roughly 18% less power. This is why high-altitude driving feels sluggish. This is why mountain passes punish engines that were calibrated for flatlands. A turbocharged engine is different, but not in the way most people assume. A turbocharger spools up on exhaust energy and compresses the intake air before it enters the cylinder, which partially compensates for altitude. Partially. The key word is partially, because the turbocharger itself is spinning in thinner air, which means it has to work harder to achieve the same boost pressure, which means it generates more heat, which means the intercooler has to work harder, which means the charge air entering the cylinders is warmer and less dense than the boost gauge suggests. The boost gauge tells you pressure. It does not tell you density, and density is what burns fuel. The Meridian Performance engine was built for maximum horsepower at high RPM on a sea-level dyno. It made 2,400 horsepower at roughly 2,100 RPM on that dyno sheet. At 5,840 feet, with a pull sled loading the drivetrain down to the point where the engine is fighting to maintain 1,400 revolutions per minute. The turbocharger on that engine is operating in a part of its efficiency map that it was not optimized for, and the intercooler is working against heat soak from a full afternoon of competition pulls in August sun, and the fuel delivery system is calibrated for conditions that do not exist at this elevation on this afternoon. The Cummins NT-C400 in Darlene's Peterbilt is a mechanical injection engine. There is no computer. There is no electronic fuel management system. There is a pump, and there are injectors, and there is a fuel plate, and there is a governor. And all of those things respond to physical adjustment in ways that Darlene had been studying and measuring and refining since the winter of 2019, when she had first driven the truck to a practice pull in Saguache County and watched it fall off the power band at 200 feet because the fuel delivery was calibrated for the 7,400-foot elevation of Poncha Springs, and not for the specific atmospheric conditions of a competition pull track in the San Luis Valley. She had spent 14 months after that making adjustments. Not random adjustments. Measured adjustments, documented in the spiral notebook, tested at specific elevations and temperatures and humidity levels, because Darlene understood that altitude is not a single variable, but a combination of pressure, temperature, and humidity that changes by the hour, and that an engine calibrated for a Tuesday morning in June at Saguache County is not the same engine you need on a Saturday afternoon in August at Fremont County. She had driven the truck to 6 different locations at 6 different elevations over those 14 months, always measuring, always writing it down, always adjusting the fuel plate and the injection timing and the boost reference by increments small enough that most people would have called them irrelevant. What she had arrived at by the 3rd week of August was a fuel delivery calibration and injection timing setting that was specific to 5,840 feet above sea level, 84 degrees Fahrenheit, and the particular humidity of a Colorado afternoon after a dry August. She had checked the weather forecast for Fremont County for 3 days before the event. She had arrived at the fairground at 7 in the morning and spent 2 hours measuring ambient temperature and checking the engine's response to the air. When she had rested her forearms on the engine and looked at it for 4 minutes that morning, she was not being sentimental. She was listening to the idle quality and comparing it to the notes in the spiral notebook. The Meridian Performance team pulled at 2:17 in the afternoon. The sun had been on the track for 6 hours by then, and the clay in the center of the lane had dried to a consistency that gave good traction, but not the soft bite that allows a tire to dig and find purchase under load. The Kenworth came off the line with the kind of noise that makes people step back from the fence. A sound like a building being demolished in a controlled sequence, deep and pressurized and continuous. The crowd which had been watching pulls all afternoon, went to attention the way crowds do when something large and expensive and loud announces itself. The Kenworth pulled 312 feet before the sled loaded it to a stop. 312 feet at 5,840 feet above sea level on a 2% uphill grade with a progressive sled is a legitimate pull. The Meridian Performance Coordinator noted it on his clipboard and looked satisfied, which he had reason to be. The previous best pull of the day had been 287 feet, and 312 feet was a margin that had held up at 3 previous events this season. The crowd gave it the applause it deserved, which was sustained and genuine. The coordinator looked down the staging lane at the red oxide Peterbilt and said something to the crew member beside him. The crew member nodded. They were not being cruel. They were being practical. 312 feet is a number that a $387,000 machine built by 6 professionals in Fort Collins has a right to be satisfied with. Darlene heard the announcement over the PA. She was standing at the rear of the Peterbilt, checking the tire pressure again with the gauge from her shirt pocket. She did not look up at the scoreboard. She put the gauge back in her pocket, walked to the driver's door, and climbed in. Now, I want you to understand what the crowd was doing at that moment. The people who had been watching all afternoon were mostly turned toward the scoring table, where the Meridian Performance Pull was being officially measured. The people near the 4th staging lane were watching the Peterbilt with the kind of attention you give to something you expect to be briefly entertaining. There were a few people at the fence near the start line who had been there all afternoon and had watched Darlene's prep routine with more interest than most, and one of them was a man named Cal Whitmore, who runs a diesel shop in Salida, and had driven over specifically because someone at the co-op in Poncha Springs had told him about a woman from Coaldale who had been doing something interesting with injection timing at altitude. Cal was standing at the fence with his arms folded and his hat pulled down, and he was not talking to anyone. There was also a boy of about 11 at the fence near the 200-foot marker, standing on the bottom rail with his chin on the top rail, and he had been there since the Kenworth pulled. He had watched the Kenworth with wide eyes, and then he had turned and watched the Peterbilt pull into the staging lane, and he had not moved since. His father was somewhere behind him in the crowd. The boy was watching the truck the way children watch things they do not yet have words for. The Peterbilt's engine started the way a well-maintained mechanical injection Cummins starts when it has been warmed up and calibrated correctly, with a sound that is lower and more deliberate than what the crowd had been hearing all afternoon. A sound that does not announce itself so much as establish itself. A deep and even percussion that settled into the air above the track and did not vary. No smoke. A faint shimmer of heat above the stacks, but no smoke, because the fuel delivery was calibrated and the air density was accounted for, and there was nothing being wasted. The crowd near the 4th lane turned. Not all at once, but in the way that sound causes people to turn. First the ones closest, then a ripple outward. The engine note was doing something that the other engines that afternoon had not done, which was to sound exactly the same at idle as it would sound under load, a consistency that people who know engines recognize as the signature of a machine that is not working at the edge of its capability, but at the center of it. The chain went tight with a single note, sharp and clean, and the Peterbilt moved. It moved the way a draft horse moves when it leans into a collar, not with drama, not with the explosive departure of a machine trying to outrun the load, but with a steady, deliberate forward motion that began at 0 and did not accelerate so much as continue. the tires pressing into the clay and finding it and keeping it, the frame settling into a slight crouch as the weight transferred rearward, the exhaust note climbing one register and holding there. At 50 feet, the sled had not yet loaded to full resistance, and the Peterbilt was moving at a pace that looked, to the crowd, like it was going to be over quickly. The Meridian Performance Coordinator had turned to watch. His expression was attentive but not concerned. At 100 feet, the sled resistance had increased to the point where the engine note deepened and the tires began to compress into the clay with enough force that you could see the track surface curl slightly at the edges of the contact patch, the way earth curls ahead of a plow. The truck had not slowed. The RPM had dropped, but the truck had not slowed, because the torque curve of a big cam Cummins at its calibrated power band does not fall off when the RPM drops. It rises. This is the thing that the dyno sheet on the Meridian Performance trailer did not capture, because dyno sheets measure peak horsepower and peak torque, and peak is not the same as the shape of the curve at the bottom. At 150 feet, the crowd near the fence had gone quiet in a way that is different from the quiet of disinterest. It was the quiet of attention, of people who were watching something and had stopped talking because talking required looking away. The boy at the 200-foot marker had not moved. At 200 feet, the Peterbilt passed the marker at the same pace it had been traveling since 50 feet, which is to say steadily, which is to say without drama, which is to say with the particular authority of a machine that is not yet at the limit of what it can do. The engine note had not changed register since 100 feet. The smoke from the stacks was a pale gray, not black, which means the combustion was complete, which means the fuel delivery and the air density were in the relationship that Darlene had calculated in the spiral notebook over 14 months of measurement. The Meridian Performance Coordinator was standing at the fence now. He was not writing on his clipboard. At 250 feet, the crowd had begun to do what crowds do when they realize they are watching something they did not expect. The sound began at the fence nearest the truck and moved outward and backward through the 4,000 people on the gravel hillside. Not a roar yet, but a sustained note of recognition. The sound of people saying things to the people beside them that all amounted to the same thing. At 300 feet, the Peterbilt was still moving. At 300 feet, the Meridian Performance Kenworth had been stopped for 12 feet. The boy at the 200-foot marker had turned to look for his father in the crowd behind him, and when he found him, he pointed at the truck with one arm fully extended, the way children point at things they need someone else to confirm. At 312 feet, the Peterbilt passed the mark where the Kenworth had stopped. The chain was still tight, the tires were still in the clay, the engine note had not changed. The crowd found its voice all at once, the way crowds do when a threshold is crossed that cannot be uncrossed, a sound that started as noise and organized itself into something directed, something aimed at the red oxide cab moving steadily up the 2% grade. At 340 feet, the sled resistance had reached the point where the engine was working at the absolute floor of its power band, the RPM somewhere around 1,100, a place where most engines are either stalling or spinning tires in an attempt to find traction they cannot maintain. The Peterbilt was doing neither. The tires were still in the clay. The frame was still in its crouch. The exhaust was still pale gray. At 358 feet, the truck stopped. Not with a lurch, not with a stall, not with tire spin or drama, but with the deliberate, dignified stillness of a machine that has gone as far as physics will allow on this afternoon at this elevation and is satisfied with the distance. The chain went slack. The engine returned to idle. The crowd on the gravel hillside was making a sound that carried across the track and up the canyon wall on the east side of the fairground. Darlene set the parking brake, shut the engine down, and got out of the cab. She walked to the rear of the truck and checked the tire pressure with the gauge from her shirt pocket. Both rear axles, all 4 drives. She wrote the readings in the spiral notebook, which she had brought with her and kept on the passenger seat. Cal Whitmore had come through the fence gate by the time she finished. He stood at the back of the truck with his arms still folded and looked at the rear axle and then at her and said, "Injection timing?" she said, "and the fuel plate." He nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when something he suspected turns out to be true, and then he looked back at the axle and said, "What elevation did you dial it for?" She said, "Here, specifically." He looked at her for a moment and then looked back at the axle and said, "Yeah." That was the whole conversation. The Meridian Performance Coordinator came over 20 minutes later, when the scoring was official and the distance had been announced over the PA, and the crowd had done what it was going to do with that announcement. He was a young man, maybe 30, and he came over without the clipboard, which meant something. He stood at the front of the Peterbilt and looked at the hood and the crease and the primer, and then he looked at Darlene, who was leaning against the driver's door with the thermos in her hand. He said, "What are you running in there?" She said, "NTC 400. He said, "Big cam?" She said, "3. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We've got 2.5 times the horsepower." She said, "I know." He looked at the truck again. Then he said, "You did something with the calibration for altitude." She said, 14 months of it. He stood there for another moment, and then he said, "We built for sea level." It was not an excuse. It was a man saying something true out loud for the first time. She nodded. He put his hand on the front of the hood, not the crease, the flat part near the center, and held it there for a second. And then he took it back and said, "I'd like to see the notebook sometime." She said, "Come by Coaldale." He said he would. He meant it. There is a photograph from that afternoon that one of the spectators posted online 3 days later that has been shared more times than the person who took it expected. It shows the Peterbilt from behind at roughly the 300-foot mark, the chain still taut, the tires pressed into the clay, and in the background you can see the crowd on the hillside in the posture of people who are leaning forward, every one of them, toward the truck. In the foreground, slightly out of focus, you can see the boy from the fence. He is still pointing. Darlene drove the Peterbilt back to Coaldale that night. She stopped for fuel in Canyon City, checked the tire pressure at the pump, and was home by 10:30. The spiral notebook went back on the shelf above the bench, next to the one from Saguache County and the one from the estate sale measurements, and the one from 1994 with the 3208 CAT service notes. The truck went back in the shop. The hood still has the crease in it. The primer is still primer. She has not entered another pull since Fremont County. Not because there's nothing left to prove, but because she's already working on the next problem, which is a set of measurements she started taking last October at a location in Chaffee County at 8,200 feet, and which has already filled 31 pages in a new notebook. Russell Pruitt died in the spring of 2021 before Fremont County. He had seen the truck, and he had seen the notebooks, and one evening in the shop he had put his hand on the Cummins block and said, "This is the right engine for this place." He didn't say anything else about it. He didn't need to. The right engine for this place. Darlene had written that down. Not in the spiral notebook, but on a piece of shop tape she stuck to the shelf above the bench, where it has been since April of 2021 and where it will stay. The ground at 5,840 feet doesn't care what something cost. The clay doesn't adjust for sponsorship budgets or laminated dyno sheets or the number of people wearing matching shirts. It tells you what it is, and what it is a measurement. And Darlene Pruitt had been taking measurements longer and more carefully than anyone else in that staging lane, and on the third Saturday of August in Fremont County, Colorado, the measurement came out the way 14 months of work said it would. If you know a story like this one, a person who spent years measuring something that nobody else thought was worth measuring, who showed up somewhere with an old machine and a notebook and a specific answer to a specific problem, drop it in the comments. I read every one of them, and I mean that. The stories that come in from the comments on this channel have led to 3 of the last 6 scripts I've written, because the people watching this channel are the people who know where the real stories are kept. There is another story like this one every week on this channel, and some of them are louder than Darlene's and some of them are quieter, but all of them are about the same thing, which is the work that gets done in shops and barns and machine sheds by people who do not guess when they can measure. If that is the kind of story you want to keep finding, the subscribe button is there, and it costs you nothing. And it means these stories find their way to you instead of getting buried. And if someone in your life would understand why a woman from Coaldale spent 14 months dialing in injection timing for a specific elevation on a specific afternoon, if you know someone who would feel this story the way the people on that hillside felt it, pass it to them. Stories like this one don't stay alive on their own. They stay alive because somebody thought of the right person to send them to. The Peterbilt is in the shop in Coaldale right now. The engine is running. You can hear the turbo whistle from the road if the wind is right. A thin, high note above the idle, the sound of compressed air at altitude, the sound of a machine that knows exactly where it is.